Hello, this is Freethought Forum, a program produced and funded by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. I'm Ralph Eisler.
And I'm Joe Barnhart. This is a show that promotes rational roots in scholarship, and we're going to focus on this today. Science and free of supernatural beliefs. Today we have a special guest in biblical scholarship. Professor Erin Darby is a faculty member at the University of Tennessee here in Knoxville, and a leader of the, pronounce that name for me.
Ein Gerendal Archaeological Project.
We'll get into that.
Which is in Jordan.
It is in Jordan.
It is in Jordan.
Yes.
Okay, well, this is a call-in show. However, we only have one phone line. So if you can't get through, we invite you to tweet them to us at FFTVKNOX. Now, while we go over a few announcements, we invite you to start calling in now at the number on the screen. Get a pen and paper, and a little while later, we'll give you our email address later in the show.
Okay, and the Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun group or an eatery at a bar tonight at Barley's in the Old City, starting around 5:30, and the experience says everyone is welcome to this happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. And of course, if you don't come to have a good conversation but want to provoke or punch, well, don't come. It's good conversation is what we want.
Yeah, right. The Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday mornings are usually lectures with a lively roundtable discussion. The book club meets on the second Sunday, and the Reflections group gets together for a potluck lunch on the fourth Sunday. Visit our websites for additional details, including times and locations.
Okay, we got a good topic coming up. Who wrote the Bible? And what are their motivations? And did Moses get all that on a stone? And did the finger of God carve it? Which finger? But beginning in the God's not left-handed, right-handed, I guess you could say. Huh?
Ambidextrous.
In the 1700s, early, people had begun questioning the traditional belief of Moses and the authorship. And toward the middle of the 1700s, that got to be stronger. And who wrote the Pentateuch? Genesis, Exodus, and so forth through Deuteronomy. How many authors? And our scholar here is Dr. Darby, and is going to discuss the hypothesis. And, well, we'll just get into the redactors and the editors and all of that, because this is a very interesting topic.
Okay, so let's go to some of the news. A few items which caught our eye were that the Catholic Archdiocese in New York, on March 31st, let me take that back. I got the date wrong. The Catholic Archdiocese in New York will close 31 of its parishes, officials announced, and merge 24 more of them. The individual mergers, which will occur August 1st, 2015, are announced by the Archdiocese. 31 churches will no longer have regular masses and other sacraments, and the other 24 mergers, both churches will remain open for religious events. This time of transition, the history will be difficult, says Cardinal Dolan. There will be many who are upset about it, and I will be one of them. Now, why do the traditional churches in the U.S. continue to lose parishioners? Perhaps it's because their message is becoming increasingly irrelevant.
Okay. Now, a Tehran court has jailed for 1 year a British Iranian woman. Why was she arrested? Trying to attend a volleyball match.
Yeah. Can you imagine that?
Yeah. She was. Well, in the case of Gavani, I guess it's the pronunciation, a 25-year-old graduate from London has drawn considerable attention because of her dual nationality and a lengthy time spent in prison before trial. That's before trial. Britain said it was concerned after hearing reports of her jail sentence. And Ghavami was detained on June 20, and the volleyball game again was to play in Italy. And you had female fans, and even women journalists were told they would not be allowed to watch females, leading to brief demonstrations, needless to say. This is, by the way, is in the 21st century. And having been in custody at least 41 days, went on trial behind closed doors for a month. And the verdict, she was sentenced to 1 year in jail. Her lawyer was quoted in Iranian medium as saying, well, there's no reason given for conviction, although she'd been accused of spreading propaganda against the regime. And I presume that means opinions against the state's viewpoint.
Yes, that's exactly what it means.
A broad charge often used by Iran's judiciary. This is one example of how women are treated not as individuals, but as possessions of men in religion-dominated societies. I watched a movie the other day on Gunsmoke. That's supposedly represented 19th century America.
Yeah.
And the way women were treated there. Sounds like it came right out of the...
Well, I'm not saying that we're that far advanced. I mean, when did women get the vote in this country? In 1920 or something?
1920s, yes.
Still no female presidents, still not equal pay,
Still not equal pay.
still
and-
colleges struggling to take care of rape and sexual assault cases.
Yeah, and in fact,
Well,
speaking about treating women as property, today's an election day. But it seems like the interest in the contestants running for office is taking second place in Tennessee compared to Amendment 1 in the Constitution. This amendment would pretty much give the Tennessee legislature carte blanche to strongly curtail women's reproductive rights. It's being promoted most assiduously by the two largest religious sects in the country, the Southern Baptists and the Roman Catholics. And there were op-ed opinions by leaders of both of these groups in the News Sentinel within the last month. It's worth noting Southern Baptists require wives to be submissive to their husbands, and that Roman Catholic hospitals still pursue a doctrine of letting both mother and fetus expire rather than aborting a non-viable fetus to save the mother's life. Misogyny is not confined to Islamic countries.
Mm-hmm. Well, I remember, I'm old enough to remember the changes have been made in this country, and we still need more, but it was just, when I was growing up, atrocious the way women were thought of as property.
Okay.
Okay, where are we now?
I'll go ahead and continue here on one more item. On Saturday, November 15th, the Rationalists of East Tennessee will sponsor a lecture open to the public titled, "Who Are the Religious Doubters?" The lecture will be presented by Tom Flynn, who's the Executive Director for the Council on Secular Humanism and the editor of Free Inquiry magazine. Tom will discuss the topic of what do polls, that is, sampling polls on people's preferences on religion, really mean, and what can we believe about them.
Tom's been following this for a number of years. So this
he's been very much involved. So, well, with those items out of the way, then let's go on to today's topic, which is sort of who wrote the Torah, and in particular, discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the so-called documentary hypothesis. So we have Professor Darby here, and she's going to tell us what the documentary hypothesis is, or maybe who wrote the Bible.
What is
You have very high expectations, don't you?
Okay.
But actually, I like that you called it the so-called, because there's not just one documentary hypothesis. There are many now. Right? There was the classic formulation of it, and now there are multiple versions of that in scholarship. So in some ways, it's moved quite far from where it started off with Julius Wellhausen and others. There are some consistent pieces that seem to have borne out time and achieved some kind of scholarly consensus. So where should we begin? Should we
let's
just talk about what it is?
What's meant by J?
Yeah,
J?
let's, Sam, you have the next slide there that I had on the, what the documentary hypothesis is? Well, in any case, about the time people started really looking into who wrote the Bible, it eventually evolved into a proposal by this fellow named Julius Wellhausen, I think around 1876, and he proposed that there were 4 authors for the Torah.
That's right.
And he called them J, E, P, and D.
Yeah, or J. Usually the D comes first only because of the way Wellhausen dated them.
Yes.
But of course, the dating is debated.
Right.
And this wasn't Wellhausen's idea initially alone. He was a moment, an important moment in scholarship, but others had suggested similar problems. And his Prolegomena became a kind of rallying point for maybe one of the most clear formulations at that moment in time of how this might work. And they weren't noticing things others hadn't noticed. The rabbis were very, very well aware of all of the inconsistencies and discrepancies and every misspelling or alternate, just the switching out 2 Hebrew characters. The rabbis knew about all of that. So a lot of the materials that led 19th century scholars to the conclusions that they reached were things that were already known, but there were other ways of trying to explain them, as there are today. But I think where we ended up was that there were 4 main sources that go into the construction of the first 5 books of what is for Christians the Old Testament, for Jews the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible. And they dated starting maybe as early as the 10th century or earlier maybe for the Yahwist, the Elohist, the Deuteronomist, and the priestly writer. And the priestly writer was the latest. So there was a spread here of, like 500 or 600 years of text. Now, where we are today is that the first 2 of those, the Yahwist and the Elohist, are harder to substantiate. They're harder to find in the text. The arguments for them are more difficult.
And why do we call them Yahwist and Elohist?
So originally, one of the reasons that led people to these names, or what led people to make these observations, is there were certain names of God that tended to be used differently in different parts of the Bible. So a classic example would be you have Elohim in Genesis 1, and then you have Yahweh Elohim in Genesis 2, and then sometimes you just have Yahweh. The rest of Genesis, almost entirely, you have a preference for the name Yahweh, but then you get to Exodus, and all of a sudden no one seems to know the name Yahweh anymore. So scholars looked at the inconsistencies, how it was possible that one name could be used in one place and a different name used over here, and yet nobody seemed to have any sense of remembering what name was used when. And so the hypothesis was certain authors preferred certain names. And
give us a little bit on just the name Elohim.
Well, Elohim is complicated. It's a plural noun in Hebrew.
Plural name.
That is usually, when it's meaning God, referred to with a singular verb. Now, plurality in Hebrew doesn't have to indicate multiple things. It could also mean the greatest or the best. So it's a way of saying that your God is kind of, it's a majestic plural in Hebrew. But sometimes it really does mean multiple gods. And so anytime you read the Bible, you have to make a decision as a translator, what do I mean? To make it even more complicated, you can hear Elohim is a cognate for Canaanite El, who was a deity worshipped in what is now Syria, so ancient Ugarit, and down probably into the Israelite territory.
You got Samuel, Ruel.
Right, and you have El in names of people. So El and Elohim and the slippage between them is a really interesting problem by itself. You have parts of the Psalter that continuously only use the name Elohim and not something else.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so it's not just the Pentateuch. This conversation happens in other parts of the Bible as well. So one of the classic formulations was that there were, at least for the first 5 books, there were these 4 sources. There were Yahwists who preferred the name Yahweh. There were Elohists who preferred the name Elohim. There were the Deuteronomists who, that isn't defined by what name of God they use. It's a particular theology or the way they talk about God, the way they talk about God's name. They prefer the language of statutes and judgments and laws. And then there is the priestly writer who is attributed with a large section of Leviticus and some of the material in Numbers, and as well as material in Genesis. And there were some problems with the original formulation.
So, but one example, of course, there are two creation stories in Genesis.
That's right.
And the first one is supposedly the priestly story. And the second one is the Yahwist story. And so if you read it and you notice the disconnects in there, it's because it was written by two different people.
And scholars are still pretty, I think, pretty persuaded that Genesis 1 is priestly and that it's late. So that was part of the issue with identifying the sources, was also dating the sources.
Right.
And so when you read the Bible and you open it up to Genesis 1 and it's describing, hypothetically, the earliest things, you tend to think of it as the earliest written, when in fact the chapter Genesis 1 is very likely written after the Babylonians destroyed Jerusalem in the 6th century.
Right, and the series of editors who eventually gathered these things together and put them together, and not necessarily in order.
At least not in the order they were written in, certainly.
Not in the order.
So it's very possible that between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, you skipped several hundred years. In terms of the date of their composition.
Right in the middle of verse 2, chapter 2.
That's right.
And so you think maybe the Genesis 2 could have been written as early as 1000 BCE?
I have a hard time dating Yahwistic and Elohistic sources. I think people were very optimistic about that.
We got a call in.
Oh.
We have a caller. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I apologize for not getting here sooner, because I tried to call as soon as Joe mentioned it, but it took a while for the pickup to happen. But anyway, and it's off the subject, and again, I apologize for that. As far as who wrote the Old Testament, I always thought that no one knew who did that. But Joe mentioned today was voting day, and he sparked a question. I just had to call in and get y'all's input on it. As I understand, there's supposed to be a separation of church and state, and you're not supposed to have preachers endorsing candidates and all of that.
That's what we're supposed to.
But we have something going on called Pulpit Freedom Sunday, where up to 1,800 churches are now publicly saying who their congregation should vote for, I guess, as if to say, God wants you to vote for Haslam or whoever's running. But I noticed, I was watching TV the other day, and they were doing a commercial about the fall festival down in Blount County. And they were interviewing a guy who was talking about the festival and about how people could park there at the church. For all they had to do was make a donation to send their people down to Florida on a mission. And on the marquee there, and this is the question, on the marquee it said, vote yes on 1. You were talking about abortion and women's rights and all that.
If you want politicians to tell women what to do with their lives and their bodies on this issue, vote yes. If you want women to run their own lives, vote no.
Well, I think the point is that churches aren't supposed to be advocates for any particular political party or person.
A person in particular.
And it's a little different here, I think, in the case of the amendment to the Constitution.
That was the question I was going to ask,
Yeah.
Its amendment is different.
It's an issue, not a candidate.
Issue.
So I think they're probably pretty safe on promoting that. But I believe there were a number of churches who also said that they were going to recommend people vote for certain candidates.
Yes. In spite of the fact that they could lose their tax-free status.
Yes.
So here I am supporting these churches with my taxes, and they're dabbling in politics, whereas they would complain they support things with their taxes that they don't care for. But I just thought the line was like I've seen a lot of churches around here with political signs on them, but I thought the differentiation was the church can say we're against abortion, or we're against abortion in these circumstances, or whatever else, or whatever stances they want to take on it. However, they shouldn't say vote yes or no on such and such amendment. Like here's our stance, but not necessarily to vote this way or that way, even on an amendment.
I think it's hard to hold them to that for the amendment. It should be that they lose their tax exemption if they advocate particular people or particular parties.
But they're doing that. They're doing that.
The IRS has been very lax on enforcing that. But I believe it was the Freedom from Religion Foundation who's gotten after them recently. And they said, well, they're going to mend their ways and they're going to start enforcing that separation. But whether they do or
I'll
not,
tell you what. Let me get off because somebody else is probably going to want to call in. But I'll tell you what, I'll be listening to your future shows, and you put that number where I should call her and report churches, and I'll do it, and I'll do my part.
Where are you calling from, by the way?
I'm calling from Blount County, down here where they charge for parking so they can send their missionaries down to Florida.
That's all right.
But anyway, I'm sorry I got off the subject, but believe me, Al is going to call in and tell you that God and Jesus wrote the Old Testament, and you should just shut up, these stupid, shows of yours.
He'd be in good company.
Okay.
Give us your phone.
Thank you for calling.
Give us your phone number, Dale.
All the way from
Send them
Maryland.
the
That's nice. Okay, let's get now this. J, of course, it's called the J document. It's called, I guess, in German, you don't have a Y.
That's right. If you want to make a yes sound in German, you're pretty much stuck with the J.
So they often call it, they got it called Jehovah, in the front, and then Elohim, and then Deuteronomy, and then P, so J-E-D-P, in the priestly documents.
Now, if we wanted to make it very complicated, we start adding numbers. So there's D1, D2, P1, P2. There's whole new sources. H. We threw one of those in there. Just so we can confuse everybody. I think the basic principle holds, which is that for scholars, the Bible is not constructed of one document written beginning to end by a single source. It's certainly a composite piece that was very artfully and carefully edited together, but by people who don't necessarily share a modern perspective on literary continuity or theology. And so sometimes these seams where sources are folded in are very, very obvious.
Well, Richard Elliott Friedman makes the point when you look at, well, why say did the editors keep both stories somewhere? You try to say, well, people knew both of these stories.
That's right.
So the redactor tried to mesh them together so they didn't look quite so contradictory, like the two Noah's Ark stories.
Right. You know what I always find interesting is the canon's move towards inclusivity rather than exclusivity. So often these texts are used to exclude people or exclude groups. And in fact, if modern people were writing the Bible, they probably wouldn't have included multiple versions of the creation or multiple versions of the Noah's Ark account. Or who kills Goliath? That's not even clear. There's 3 different versions about the mythologies concerning Goliath.
It's a little bit like family reunions when everybody has their own.
That's right, but so they incorporated them in a way that Ecclesiastes is. Why is that in there? That's exactly the kind of book a lot of people would kick out if they were putting it together now. So I actually think the fact that you can see the seams sometimes is an interesting part of the process where they were designating how they put together text and what texts they thought were important.
Well, it's similar in the New Testament. You got the Epistle of Barnabas.
Sure, right. Yeah, what do you do with that? That's right.
And even if you have things in the Codex Sinaiticus.
That's right. That's right.
In the Bible, as we have it today. And yet it's in that Bible in the St. Catherine Monastery.
So this was very controversial. People lost their job. People still lose their jobs today over critical biblical scholarship. There have been, in the last 2 or 3 years, several people I know who have lost their modern teaching positions because they've espoused some version of
What
the
teachers?
Bible
these are
being
more-
compiled.
These are more fundamentalist.
That's right. But my point, though, is that it took a lot of guts for early scholars to start talking this way,
Yeah.
particularly in the West.
In my first year of teaching, now that school where I taught is no longer like this, but I was called in 3 times by the president.
Oh, really?
And I had no children then, so I just wrote up what he said
Yeah.
and distributed everywhere.
Right.
And he quit doing it after a while.
I have a close friend who lost his job a few years ago because he wrote an op-ed for the Huffington Post saying that the way women are described in the Hebrew Bible those texts shouldn't be used to model how women should be treated today.
Yeah.
And he lost his job about
Really?
this. So critical biblical scholarship, in some ways, still creates great controversy, but certainly did in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Lots of very, very esteemed scholars
One
were
way
in
a
difficult
teacher-
positions because of this theory.
Yeah, I'm surprised. I can see that happening maybe at very fundamentalist colleges, but I remember a few years ago we had a fellow named Garrett Ludeman here. He's a member of the Jesus Seminar, and he had gotten to the point where he said he just didn't believe the miracles or the supernatural stories in the Gospels. And so he was from Tübingen, I think, in Germany.
And German tradition, yeah.
So I think he kept his job, but he was prohibited from teaching.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was on a program with him in I think either New York or Florida. I can't remember where it was, but it came more from a Lutheran tradition.
Sure.
German, and you would think they would be more open.
But it depends.
I mean, I had the German scholarship, my goodness.
Yeah.
Well, I notice sometimes a good teacher nowadays will use what I call the polyphonic method, which I borrowed from Dostoevsky. I learned it. I say, well, this group says A, B, and C. The next group says B, C, D, and A. And you never identify yourself with any of them.
Right.
But you do get all the views out.
That's right.
I think we have another caller here.
Advocate.
Yes.
Hello,
Go
caller.
ahead.
Can you give us a name or nickname?
From Freethought. This is Charles from Central Illinois.
Oh,
Oh,
good,
hi, Charles.
St. Charles. Go.
I have a question. After all the wars and infighting and so forth, what's the actually physically oldest object that we can verify it from the early Hebrew traditions?
So do you mean an object that's inscribed with text, or do you mean an object that we could associate with ancient Israelites?
Well, I know they found some very old archaeological artifacts, but I was thinking more of the lines of texts.
So it depends on how you want to deal with it. There was an amulet found in a tomb that's a site called Ketef Hinnom, and it's a silver amulet, and the tomb deposit that it's part of was dated, I think, to the 7th century, so that's the 600s BCE. And on it is a section of the priestly benediction that also appears in the Book of Numbers.
Okay.
So if you agree with their dating, and it's a tomb context, and the tombs aren't particularly well preserved, so there was a lot of material that fell into the tombs from later in history. The roofs were missing.
Yeah.
So dating the deposit is not easy.
Yeah.
But if you buy their dating, then that would give you a kind of 6th century or 7th century
7th century.
earliest horizon for a text as it stands also in the Hebrew Bible.
Charles, we got music background coming from you.
I think it's a train.
Is that a
Yeah,
time?
hold on
Yeah.
one second.
Okay. Now,
But now if you want
There we go.
inscriptions that refer to the name Yahweh, we have some that date to the 9th century, so 200 years earlier. There are two. There's one from a site called Kuntilat Ajrud and one from a place called Kirbet El Kom. And in both cases, they attest to groups of people worshiping a deity named Yahweh, but they don't tell us much about Yahweh that corroborates or doesn't corroborate what's in the Bible, other than clearly a deity named Yahweh was worshipped in Israel as early as the 9th century. So that's not nothing, but it's not like having any actual physical evidence of a biblical text.
So you have a name, but you don't have any content.
I think
that's
the
right.
actual earliest mention of the term Israelite is on the Merneptah stele.
It is. It's a gentilic. So it's rather than a country name, it's a people name.
Yeah, it's a people name.
And so, but again, that's got almost it doesn't really help us date the construction of biblical narrative.
No, it doesn't.
It just tells us somebody named Israelites were in that particular territory by that point.
It's kind of a cultural like or a tribal thing almost.
Right. Now, I'm aware that there's a strong, at least in some scholarly circles, idea that Yahweh, or however it's pronounced properly, was in fact the equivalent of Jupiter or Marduk or so forth as the head of the Oham, which is a plural, and a kind of a pantheon.
Yeah, so the question, I guess, that you're asking is, was ancient Israel monotheistic? And the answer is no. The Bible's very clear. Ancient Israel wasn't monotheistic. Yeah. That's why you keep having people complaining about Israel worshiping other deities. So in those two inscriptions that I mentioned, they're somewhat controversial because they talk about Yahweh and what's usually translated his Asherah. And I don't want to get into the problems with the word Asherah here, but some scholars feel that that's referring to a goddess. I don't think we even need to talk about those inscriptions to say, clearly ancient Israelites worshipped multiple deities. Yahweh was considered the national deity, the deity whose temple was in Jerusalem, who was basically the patron of the Davidic line in the south. Right. He was also worshipped in the north in national temples.
It wasn't just another name for some of the Canaanite gods.
So somebody like Mark Smith, who's written extensively about how Israelite tradition adopted Canaanite tradition, has suggested that it's very possible attributes that were originally ascribed to Baal or to El or to other Canaanite deities were co-opted into the worship of Yahweh. And it's also possible that there might have been beliefs about Yahweh that were later strategically forgotten because they might have been considered problematic.
Okay, good.
So in a sense, I wouldn't say that Yahweh was equivalent to Marduk himself, but I would say it's more likely that Israelite religion borrowed elements, certainly, from Levantine religion more broadly, and that the same way that Marduk is the national deity of Babylon, Yahweh is the national deity of Israel in the Iron Age.
Well, how does that fit in with the so-called Kenite theory?
Which one?
That's why I use words. So, that Moses was his father-in-law.
Sure. I think the Bible has multiple origin stories for the Israelites. So sometimes it sounds like they're from what is today modern Syria, Aram, or the Arameans. Sometimes it sounds like they're from the Canaanites. I think most scholars would tell you that Israel, the nation, emerges from the Canaanite population, perhaps with the addition of other elements. What happens prior to the Iron Age is, of course, the total collapse of all civilization across the Mediterranean.
Yes.
And so Israel is just one of many communities that emerge on the other side of that late Bronze collapse.
Right.
That probably has elements from different ethnic traditions combined.
Yeah, that's...
So as far as I'm concerned, there's a ring of authenticity to a continuity between Canaanite occupation and Israelite occupation. The material culture seems to bear that out to some extent.
Yeah.
In the book, The Bible Uncovered, they make a great deal of all the commendations that the Deuteronometrist gave to all and the Levitics priesthood gave to all the people that would worship on hilltops and so forth.
I mean, we were talking about Finkelstein and Silberman before the program, actually, and there are things I like a lot about that book. I'm not especially persuaded that the stories about Josiah and Josiah's reform are historically accurate, but that book does a really good job showing how a number of the texts in the Bible could have emerged in the 8th through 6th centuries, exactly when Judah has enough power and authority and internal cohesion to develop a priestly caste whose responsibility would be the production of ancient texts.
Yes. And
the survival of the survivors of the occupation of the Assyrians.
That's right.
And the Babylonian captivity and so forth.
That's right. I think if you haven't read Mark Smith's work on Israelite religion and how it brings together elements from Canaanite religion, then I would suggest anything that he's written is great.
Yeah,
that you think critically about that.
Just titled, basically, monotheism growing out of polytheism. I've forgotten the exact title, but those words are in the title.
Could be the evolution of God.
It's the evolution or development of this process.
Really, Israelite monotheism doesn't fully emerge until after the exile.
It's
late.
That's my impression.
I think at least that's my feeling too.
Well, you have the reason it seems this is so difficult is you have problems to solve. For example, are you going to incorporate wisdom into God? You see, or is wisdom Sophia? If it's
was it separate from God? Was it present at creation?
So you have
there, I think it's in Proverbs 22. I'd have to look up. It's almost as if wisdom is a companion.
Well, Proverbs 8 especially. You have these apostrophes
that's what it
to wisdom, where wisdom appears to be kind of coexistent, or the first creation. There's some texts in Job that also flirt with this idea that wisdom was created or at creation with God. And of course, eventually rabbinics borrows that to establish Torah as being co-present at creation or God's first creation.
Now, Philo, the rabbi, changes that from the Greek.
That's right.
From Sophia, which is feminine, to logos.
So, Charles, we've done all the talking here. You want to get a few words in there?
One final question.
Sure.
Who wrote the Song of Songs? It didn't seem to be very priestly or anything.
So the problem with JEDP has always been that it struggles to account for all of the books, right? The theory has primarily been about the construction of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And then there were questions about, well, what do you do with texts in Jeremiah that seem to look a whole lot like Deuteronomy? Do you have a Deuteronomistic redaction of Jeremiah? Do you have a Deuteronomistic redaction of Hosea? What do you do with anything that's in the writings section of the Hebrew Bible, like Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, Proverbs, right? And for the Song of Songs in particular, there's been a lot of scholarly conversation that wants very badly to attribute the composition to female authors. And while
it sticks out like a sore thumb in all the rest of them.
So
it has a completely different attitude.
It's an unusual piece of literature. The rabbis knew it was unusual. They talked about it. They were working through what to do with it. Early Christian exegesis also struggled with what to do with the Song of Songs. If you read Near Eastern erotic literature, it doesn't seem out of the ordinary at all.
No, it doesn't.
So if you read, there's a lot of erotic literature from Mesopotamia and Egypt, and Song of Songs fits very well into the genre. But the fact that it made it into the Bible is pretty remarkable. I personally don't see enough evidence for female authorship to say one way or another, but it doesn't fit into the prescribed categories that normally are part of the documentary hypothesis. You're right about that.
I got you. Now, let's shift over to Esther.
Okay, I'll let you get on with the show.
Okay. Charles, thanks for calling in.
What's interesting
we're glad to have you.
To me about Esther is
what's not interesting about Esther?
One is I don't think the word any word for God occurs in the whole book, does it?
That's right. And actually, the rabbis debated Esther. There were conversations about Esther and Ecclesiastes both, about whether it was equally inspired or not and what you do with it.
And how it got there and who put it there.
And it took a long time. The conversation about Esther, went way into, the early centuries CE. So
the fact that
there it is.
That you don't have the name God and you have a woman who's a hero.
Now, in some ways, it reads a lot more like Tobit or Judith from the Apocrypha.
Oh, yes.
And in fact, that's more or less the period of composition, right? So it's kind of remarkable that it ended up in the canon and those other ones didn't.
Yeah.
I think part of it might be what versions and what languages it was preserved in.
Accept it, huh?
Yes.
Yeah, they do, yeah.
Oh, yeah, she's a great hero.
Yeah, I know.
Well, because otherwise, what do you dress up for Halloween if you don't have Esther? As a woman, you're sort of running out of
And
options.
you got to distinguish, just as you got a lot JEPD, you got JEPD versions of Baptists. You agree?
You just
Yeah.
do a redactional theory of Baptists.
Yeah, I'm sure. You were talking a little bit about splitting these up somewhere,
Yeah.
like Deuteronomist 1,
Yeah.
Deuteronomist 2, who may have written the what they call Deuteronomistic
history, yeah.
some of the other books of the Bible there. But I was always fascinated by the fact that the Deuteronomy just happened to be discovered in the temple during Josiah's time.
Which is a theory, right? So
Yeah.
in the narrative in Kings, it doesn't say anything about what they discovered. All the King's narrative says is a scroll was discovered. So Wellhausen and others hypothesized that scroll must be a kernel of the middle chapters of Deuteronomy.
I see.
Partially because some of the language in the narrative in Kings is very similar to the language in Deuteronomy. Thus we get the Deuteronomistic historian, right? So that's an entire scholarly hypothesis. The Bible itself never says what scroll was found. Only that a scroll was found, and that what they learned from it was that they were not they weren't participating in some of the ceremonies correctly, and that they were worshiping some things they weren't supposed to be doing. So that the whole thing is scholarly conjecture, that it's Deuteronomy.
How much child sacrifice was going on in humans?
That's it. So it's an open question, right? I mean, right now we're still trying to deal with how much child sacrifice the Phoenicians actually did, and there we have much better evidence
the
for
bones,
it. So our cremation burials, and my point is, if we're not really entirely clear what the Phoenicians actually did, how are we going to be clear about what the Israelites did? There are passages that if you translate them a certain way, you could translate them as the Israelites were causing their children to pass through the fire to Molech. And that is a cognate for a Phoenician deity, okay. But it shows up every once in a while pretty irregularly. And it's not clear exactly how frequently this happened. It's not clear if it was just a pejorative thing where the authors are saying this was happening without it actually occurring.
So you missed the pun, as it were.
So for me at least, I really want to see more evidence from the Phoenician cultural milieu about how this would work before I would then say anything about the Israelite milieu. I think they clearly, the authors of the Bible, were aware or perceived that this happened. But we perceive a lot of things happen about another people group that don't necessarily happen. And so then you can reuse those as a kind of slur.
But blood sacrifice was almost a necessity, it seems.
Well, so of animals, at least. Yeah, absolutely. So the question is, though, of children. Now, there are some...
You got two passages in there. You got two stories in the Hebrew Bible.
Oh, you're talking about the sons?
Dealing with sacrifice. The guy who sacrificed his daughter. And
Jephthah. Yeah, although that's supposed to be an example of this going really poorly. Like it's in Judges, which is the sort of slow slide to the reason we need a monarchy, right? Because things had gone so badly up until that point. So the way Judges functions currently, it sort of stands to show why they thought a monarchy should exist. So Jephthah is a kind of negative example. Right? He's kind of sucks. And then you have, of course, the Abraham narratives. There's another one, depending on how you translate it in Kings, about there's I can't remember if it's a Syrian king that hypothetically, or one of the Canaanite kings who hypothetically sacrifices his sons in the construction of the city of Jericho, which isn't supposed to be rebuilt.
Well, you got the Moab story.
So there's that too.
Moab,
But that depends on how you translate it. And so for me, it's still a matter of I would like to see more actual evidence for how and if child sacrifice really did occur before I start reading the Bible as a description of events rather than as a polemic. There are plenty of times where you perceive something negative about another people group. Whether or not they're actually doing it, it doesn't matter. You perceive it that way, and then you repurpose that as a way of slurring somebody else.
And the books in the Bible weren't necessarily written as history as we know it today.
Sure.
Would you say if you have a polemic, that must be something? For example, I don't know of any condemnation of chewing on the ears of giraffes. Because nobody's doing it.
Okay, but take the word Canaanite in and of itself. When you read the word Canaanite, is it referring to an actual people group? Or has Canaanite become
a slur word?
A slurred. So I can just, oh, you Canaanite. The way kind of people still use the word Philistine. Oh, you're such a Philistine, right? That doesn't mean that Philistines were actual. If we say the word Philistine,
It's
we
like
mean
the word redneck.
yeah, as someone who's backwards, who's uncivilized, who is
Wait a minute,
inappropriate.
You're talking about my relatives.
It doesn't mean the Philistines were actually that way. The perceived meaning of it is then repackaged as a way of slurring somebody else.
Yeah, it was the ancient way of what is called
Put
framing.
a cut down or a cut,
Yeah,
putting somebody in.
it's like who's this guy once who really developed the art of framing the political discussion.
Yeah. Sure.
And so
there doesn't have to be any truth to the basis of it. If it's widely perceived that gypsies are bad, I can call you a gypsy. Doesn't matter if gypsies really are bad.
I remember the opposite of happening. Somebody was making fun of someone in my neighborhood when I was a kid, and my mother, just an old mountain woman, said, "You talking about this person over there?" I said, "Yeah, we were just kids." She said, "If I'm not mistaken, I think they've got 2 eyes and a nose and like you, a big mouth." And I put right in perspective.
Fair enough.
Yeah, right. Well, you could have been called a liberal, huh?
In that context, perhaps.
She was a liberal there trying to straighten me out.
So the debate about the multiple Ds or the multiple Ps, is that did Josiah and the priests actually find a section of Deuteronomy? Because if they did, then you might draw the conclusion that the original Deuteronomistic history was written before the exile.
Oh, yes.
And so a lot of people said, okay, that would be Joshua through 2 Kings, and that the original version of that must have been before the Judeans are exiled to Babylon, because they found this scroll, which must have been Deuteronomy. But if you start pulling at that thread, the tapestry becomes unwoven very quickly, and you find that you have very little reason to date the construction of those narratives before the exile versus after the exile. So then you have people who say, well, all of that material must have been after
Exile.
the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians. And so then they fight with each other.
Yeah.
So the things like the 586 destruction, 722 things, now that's pretty historical, we think.
Yeah, I think 722 and 586, no question.
But
Absolutely.
now from the Exodus from Egypt, that's another ballgame. Is that right?
Yeah, there's not a lot we can do with that.
That's so you got a mixed bag in this.
You do. So I mean, and the Bible itself says that it's citing things. It talks about the book of Jasher. It talks about the books of the Acts of the Kings. So it refers to books we do not have. And it does it regularly in Kings and Chronicles
that's what we
both.
discussed before. I mean, how do you disentangle what is actually truth from what is legend in the Bible? Getting back to Deuteronomy, I seem to remember that the first part of it praised Josiah quite highly. I may be mistaken on that, which made me suspicious about being found in the temple.
The issue with Josiah is, in the ancient Near East, when a king ascends to the throne, the first thing a king does is reform the temples.
Yeah.
It's just part of the kingly duties.
Yeah.
And so there's a kind of narrative there that sounds like the narrative of a king, say, like Sennacherib or Esarhaddon or an Assyrian monarch. So that makes it difficult to know whether Josiah really did these things or whether this is the biblical author using a trope or a genre to describe a particularly important moment in Israel's history.
Yes.
Archaeologically, it's very difficult to look for any evidence of the cultic reform. So I'm an expert on figurines. And we have no evidence that female figurines, let's for a second set aside the question of whether they're goddesses or not, we have no evidence that anything changed throughout the entire course of Josiah's reign.
Oh.
So,
no evidence.
so looking for evidence that somehow cultic objects were destroyed or put out of use, or
physical evidence,
or that he destroyed the high places and brought
it's
all
very
the worship back to the
difficult.
temple.
It's difficult to find evidence of that. A, it's such a short period of history, but B, people have tried and people continue to try. But it's not easy actually to come up with those dates. And so until I see something more persuasive, I tend to think that the Josianic reform is less accurate and more polemic. But, it's the sort of polemic that you would include about a king.
Yeah,
well,
interesting.
Would you say that in some ways you had the perpetual redaction, even in this country?
Yeah.
Remember, you have what's called the Jefferson Bible.
Right.
There is
That's right.
a
Just took
good
everything
example of redaction. He is saying there's something important there in the New Testament, but some of it a rational man and woman cannot accept.
Right.
And so he weeds out all of these miracles and he keeps the teachings of Jesus.
It's redaction based on reduction.
Yeah, that's right. Although, so 2 examples on either end of the spectrum, that happened in Mesopotamia and Egypt as well. They were constantly reviewing their own literary traditions and revising them. So the Gilgamesh flood epic, dating to the Old Babylonian period, is a rewrite of a rewrite of a rewrite. So thinking of the Bible as a continuous editing and redacting doesn't make it out of the usual for ancient Near Eastern literature. They were in Egypt and Mesopotamia both antiquarians. They constantly dug back into their own literary traditions to bestow authority on the current ruler and revised as they went.
That's a good point.
And so, in the Near East, that's what happens.
We are doing this the same.
And we're doing it now.
And, there's a guy in Oklahoma who, in effect, is rewriting in his mind, and for some of the way the Constitution was written.
Sure.
And it's written like an evangelical. Jerry Falwell wrote the Constitution almost.
But my students some of my students will insist that the entire Bible, has never changed. And I ask them, okay, so when's the last time anybody heard a sermon on Song of Solomon?
That's a good point.
So technically there is a canon within a canon, isn't there? There is the material that you actually encounter on a regular basis. And then there's all the stuff that nobody ever preaches about or teaches about, or the stuff that is omitted from lectionaries, or the stuff that is changed whenever you read it in a children's Bible or a Sunday school lesson.
And Calvin did
so
not.
Functionally speaking, people are adding and subtracting all the time.
Yeah, we had one of our RIT meetings. We had Tina Shepherdson talk to us about
she's great.
About Bibles, and I say, well, something in the Bible. She say, which Bible?
Yeah, whose Bible and what period of time? Right. I mean, the Dead Sea Scroll community had more copies of the Book of Enoch. Then they had the majority of the stuff that's in the canon. So does that not betray that for that community, Enoch was more authoritative or important than 2/3 of what's in the Tanakh?
Yeah, for that community.
Right. So absolutely. And Tina's dealing with the New Testament context and Gospels in different locations and different Gospels.
Well, in the New Testament, you have the woman taken in adultery.
Sure. Right.
And it's not in some of the better texts.
Well, and if you think of a period of time before the Gospels were transcribed together, what do you do with one community that has Mark and nothing else? They don't know anything about about the birth narratives.
Right.
If they have the earliest manuscript of Mark, they don't know about the resurrection. So access to texts and to stories changes what a community does.
And the 16th chapter of Mark, most scholars think it was just tacked on. Wasn't in the original at all.
Right, later.
Yeah. So, argue, well, now how could a gospel end in the Greek word gar? Well, actually, find in Homer and some of the other.
Oh, they end with 4 at the end.
Or they end in gar.
Nice. I mean, but in the Hebrew Bible, we've got a similar situation with the book of Jeremiah. It is it's longer in the Masoretic tradition than it is at Qumran in the Dead Sea Scrolls or in the Septuagint. So does that, what part?
Right.
Clearly, the ancient world was full of creativity and was doing constant literary activity. So what moment are you going to go to for the originally inspired second?
Why would Calvin didn't know enough about the textual criticism?
He knew a lot, though.
He was in that sense in that tradition, but he rejected the story of the woman taken in adultery. Was that because of textual reasons?
Oh, I have no idea.
Now Luther didn't reject it.
Right.
So I was just wondering, is there? You can have a textual reason, then you can have a literary reason, then you can have a moral reason.
That's right.
And I wonder if it'd be interesting. I don't know enough about Calvin's reason for doing that.
No, nor do I.
It didn't make it clear when he wrote about it.
Right.
So, if we date, say, the Bible earliest, the Old Testament earliest, 900 to 1000 BCE,
for which there's no evidence, right? It's total conjecture.
Total conjecture.
Yeah.
But let's conjecture on how much oral tradition.
So for a while, it was really fashionable to say it was all oral tradition. It was a nice out, right?
Yeah.
So and there are texts that seem to indicate there was an oral tradition, some more than others. So some of the stories in David's rise to the throne, some of the stories in Judges seem like they could have been orally transmitted. For a long time, people tried to date certain kinds of Hebrew poetry, so the Song of the Sea and the Song of Deborah, and tried to say, okay, because of the features of the Hebrew, this must be old and was probably recited. That is less of a consensus now, but I think there are parts of the Bible that certainly were they were stories passed down.
Yes.
Otherwise, why, again, do we have three different traditions about Goliath?
Well, yeah, I was going to say I would defend the oral tradition on some things because it explains
so I
more.
think we have evidence of it, but what I think people, you still have this issue if you're going to argue for the doctrine of inspiration. If you have oral traditions, you can't just assume that there was one originary moment. There might be four different oral traditions circulating at the same time or more.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so I like the fact that it points to it gets us away from a stematic model where there was one thing that then variances arose from that. I like the idea that there were multiple versions of things.
And if you're around the campfire, you're going to have redaction going on.
And even in contemporary and modern Bedouin poetry, there's a structure, right, that makes the poem a poem, but within that structure there's a great deal of flexibility for improvisation. And so that's often true in storytelling, right? You have a structure, but you also have improvisation given the particular moment. So that leads us away from an idea that there was always only one true inerrant
I remember
meaning.
a sermon Billy Graham was preaching on Daniel the lions, and then they had Daniel saying, "Move over to the line." That's not in the Bible, but it made a good story.
It's a nice story.
Yeah, okay.
So conceivably, this has been very difficult for both Jewish and Christian fundamentalists to deal with. And I've got colleagues who are themselves Orthodox Jews who have been trying very hard to explain to other Orthodox Jews exactly
That would be
documentary hypothesis and critical scholarship, because they have some of the similar challenges that you see in Christianity.
Oh, I'm sure well, that's what all we've been talking about here right now is the Old Testament, right? The Torah. And,
Absolutely.
I would think that would be a problem. I don't know. I don't have any Jewish rabbis in my circle of friends to talk to them about this.
Well, what's interesting in studying the Hebrew Bible, is here there are people inheriting a tradition, and in the process trying to solve problems, and trying to deal with their lives. And storytelling is part of the way
people do
trying to theorize.
Right, or theodicy, right? What else is theodicy but trying to come to grips with horrible things that have happened to you? So what is Jeremiah? What is Ezekiel? Other than a genre of literature that's trying to make sense of horrible things that have happened to the community, and how then can they proceed in light of that?
So we're about ready to close.
Yeah, not quite, but
I'll get ready for it. Huh?
Get her winding down to it here.
Okay.
If you have your closing words there.
And I don't have. Have you got some closing words for us? You're our guest.
Well, what we'll do is just spread these out here. But boy, it's been great having you on here, and I have to say that I'm not an expert on Bedouin poetry at all.
Neither am I.
And so
I love that.
I find that to be rather enlightening. So anyhow, we have about a minute to go, so it's time to start wrapping things up. Get out your pen and paper.
It's been a Freethought Forum program by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee.
So please send us feedback. You can leave voicemail at 865-272-9060, or you can email us at freethoughtforum@yahoo.com.
And you can see this show most Tuesday from 5 to 6. I want to thank Sam for being with us and for our guest.
Oh, yeah.
It's always fun.
But you got to learn to express yourself.
And we would encourage you to watch future shows and be a participant. I mean,
thank you, Charles.
We don't just always want to sit here and talk. We like to take calls from you people out in the audience. So please